Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm David Meyer, I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it really is a great pleasure to have all of you here in this room and many others joining us by Zoom to celebrate the life of a truly remarkable person, a remarkable friend, loved one, colleague, teacher, and leader in everything he did. Before we go further, I want to extend a very special welcome to the members of Bob's family who are here with us today. Of course, his beloved wife, Dauphine, and their children, Alexandra Sloan Kelly, Caroline Sloan, and her husband, Drew, and Edward Sloan, and Bob's brother, Richard Sloan. Welcome. Dauphine's sister, Jean de Montlaur, is here as well. Welcome. And then joining us also on Zoom are Bob's sisters, Barbara Goodman and Catherine Sloan, Bob's nephew, Cameron Goodman, and Dauphine's sister, Marie Gallup. So it's a pleasure to have all of you join us, and I want to extend a special thank you to Dauphine as well, who took a leading role in assembling this really wonderful program of speakers. I'm going to, in the interest of time, defer to the speakers, so I will not say more about Bob's remarkable life and accomplishments and the qualities of his character, and we'll defer to the speakers to fill that in through their own reflections. But I will just say, just personally, to take the opportunity to express my own really deep admiration and affection for Bob. Bob was someone, as all of us know in this room who knew Bob, know that he was somebody of dazzling talent and learning and interests, but he was also someone who had this amazing quality of humanity to him in everything. Every time I rounded a corner and saw Bob in the hallways here, you know, my spirit lifted for seeing Bob, and every conversation I had with him, I left having learned at least 6 new things I didn't know before from Bob, but also just feeling better about myself and about the world we live in for having Bob in it. So he was a hugely important part of this community here at Tulane Law School and many other communities across his remarkable life. But we're thrilled to be able to reflect on those qualities and his story through the speakers today. I'm going to turn over the program first to Bob's and Dauphine's daughter, Alexandra, to lead us off, and then I'm going to, again, from the interest of time, not take further time to introduce each of the speakers individually. A bit about their backgrounds is reflected on the program, and we'll ask each of the speakers to follow one on the other, and then I will just insert myself one other time before the end of the program to introduce a speaker who will be joining us virtually, Justice Eliakim Rubinstein. So with that, I will turn the program over to Alexandra.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. My name is Alexandra Sloan, and I'm Bob's eldest. When I learned that Tulane Law School was putting together this wonderful event for my father, one thing came to mind: mentorship. I don't know how it is at Tulane, but at my law school, students were strongly encouraged toward one path after graduation, and that was big law. That emphasis made sense. It's the safest, surest path to success. However, I was completely uninspired to apply for such a job. And for all his excellent mentoring abilities, which many of you have experienced, my father gave me almost no advice on career paths. He was the opposite of overbearing. I think my siblings can attest to that. In fact, he only gave me one piece of advice. He said it didn't matter where I worked, that wherever I went, the most important thing was to find someone that was going to take an interest in me and make me work hard to produce results of the highest quality. Find great mentors, he said, and after that, things have a way of falling into place. At the moment, I did not find this helpful. I wanted him to tell me exactly what to do. But he didn't, and I didn't listen to Northwestern. Instead, I used a public interest grant to work at a capital punishment organization here in New Orleans, LCAC. And after my judicial clerkship, motivated solely by the desire to experience New York in my 20s, I took a job at a boutique firm in Midtown that represented institutional plaintiffs who, we argued, had been duped into buying poor quality mortgage-backed securities. We were right, of course. And these 3 jobs had absolutely nothing in common, except for 2 things. 1, Manhattan and New Orleans are both great places to drink. 2, at all 3 jobs, I found invaluable mentors. Wonderful people who still guide me, personally and professionally, to this day. Then I finally took a job at a big firm. My husband and I moved to Los Angeles, West Coast, sunshine, Hollywood, and I hated it. 2 months after I started, I was miserable and aimless. I remember an extremely long call with my father, the headline of which was, "Do not quit this job." Again, not what I wanted to hear. This time his advice for me was to try my best to find things that I enjoyed about the firm. And he reminded me to find someone who took an interest in me. He said if I came up empty in a year or 2, then I could think about switching. Shortly after that conversation, I signed up for an asylum case and had the most rewarding experience of my career up to that point. I was helping a Honduran transgender woman to get out of detention and on a path to U.S. citizenship. I hadn't known that the firm leaders supported lawyers' pro bono pursuits to that extent. And right after that, I met my first great mentor at the firm who helped me feel more at home, both at the firm and in Los Angeles. A mentor who is currently helping me realize a dream of pursuing criminal defense work, and it's been 6 years. So in the end, I said what so many of us in this room have said before: Bob Sloan was right. Take the job, do the work, and focus on finding mentors. Sadly, you'll never find one as good as and as wonderful and as giving and as brilliant as my father, but you will find someone. They're out there, and after that, things have a way of falling into place. Thank you.
Especially because the eldest daughter got to speak, so the second daughter had to speak too. So I'm Caroline. I'm the second daughter, but not the least. So I live in North Carolina, where I'm a primary care doctor. And actually, I'm not going to give my own speech. I'm going to read the speech that my father's very good friend, Marshall Goldberg, would have given if he could be here today. So I'm going to just give a little intro about him, since he can't do it for himself. So Marshall and my dad met when they both worked in the Senate way back when, which you'll hear more about very soon. So Marshall was counsel for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, where he was lead counsel on the extension of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. He later, a few years later, moved to LA to make it big and became a writer for LA Law, The Jeffersons, and a bunch of other cool shows. And he's continued to have an amazing career since then, acting as general counsel for the Writers Guild of America. He wrote a novel. He teaches or taught at both Stanford and University of Michigan law schools, and is now filming a documentary. So when my mom asked him to send his introduction, this is what he said. I guess the best introduction is to say I was Bob Sloan's friend for almost 50 years, and as one would imagine, enjoyed every moment. I'm currently in Nashville, working on a documentary series about the criminal justice system, and that prevents me from attending the tribute to Bob on November 15th. The series puts the audience in the shoes of indigent criminal defendants as they go through the system. No professors or charts or narrator. It shows as much as possible what the actual experience is like. It had better be good because I'm missing a hell of a memorial ceremony. So now I have to do his speech justice because he said that. So here's his speech. I met Bob not long after he finished law school when he was a legislative assistant for Senator Charles Percy in Washington. It was the start of a friendship that lasted almost 50 years. And 3 things stand out about Bob from that time. 1, he looked the same then as he did for the rest of his life, though the gray suit and tie did eventually loosen up to a blue blazer and tie. He had that wonderful smile that appeared most often when he was making fun of himself. And he had a lean frame that I thought came from his absolutely atrocious eating habits, but continued even after Dauphine and the kids had him eating more sensibly, kind of. 2, he had an intellectual humility and curiosity that made him a joy to be around. He always gave the other person the presumption of an honestly held, well-thought-out position that came from values he could respect. It started with an innate graciousness, but it was more than that. Bob was so bright and so knowledgeable and well-read, but I think he was the most modest man I ever met. He believed that other people always had something to offer, something to teach him. What a marvelous quality. In those days, the Senate was actually a functioning legislative body, and to get anything done, you had to work with the other side and find common ground. Bob thrived in that atmosphere because he didn't think in terms of sides or parties or labels. Senator Percy was a Republican, and Bob was essentially a liberal Democrat. But to Bob, Percy was a decent man, and Bob would have run through a brick wall for him, because Percy's decency and integrity were all that mattered. People opened themselves to Bob because they felt he would see them and their ideas in the best possible light. It's a very European trait in the best sense to focus on the substance of the person and not what they do or their politics. I think that's one reason there were hundreds of people on the Zoom funeral from all over the world, because he was a man who never closed himself off with borders or ideology or membership. He was interested in you as a person, and it brought out the best in everyone he knew. And third, I remember his wince that I saw on occasion through the next 50 years when he encountered someone whose values he just couldn't respect, try as he might. That wince was not one of impatience or even disgust, as it was with the rest of us, but sadness and lament that someone would waste an opportunity to make the world better because of their ill motives. I don't think he ever accepted that as a part of life. I think bad intentions was the only thing that ever confused him. I'm so curious to hear other people talk about Bob in other phases of his life. Having been his friend for over 50 years, I can honestly say that the only thing that really changed about him was his clothes and occasionally his car. God, I miss him. Thanks, Marshall.
You can't see it from where you are, but in front of me is a picture of Senator Percy and Bob. Oh, you can? Okay, good. That's kind of where Bob and I first came into contact. Losing Bob is a heartfelt loss to all of us. Of all the people I've come to know, he's right at the very top of my estimation. His unassuming manner, his values, his extraordinary intellect, as Marshall noted, and Marshall was a good friend of mine as well. His uncommon humility and his dry wit, his humor, his dry wit, have always been something of a model for me, both in my own life and in how I want my own 3 children to grow up and emulate. As his son, Edward, noted during last year's memorial service, Bob was kind and gentle and virtuous like no other, always giving of himself. Modest to a fault, he'd cringe at the slightest intimation of admiration for his attainments, and instead he'd immediately deflect by words of praise to anyone who might try and give him a compliment. He went out of his way to establish friendships and maintain those friendships, and always, as Dean Meyer indicated, always left you with a good feeling of yourself. You wanted to be with him, and he left an optimistic feel in that relationship. Having worked alongside him for 5+ years during the 1970s, mid-70s, he came to be a best friend. He was part of my own intimate wedding party, as I was in his when he married Dauphine in Rome, which was a wonderful occasion. Yet for all his genuine niceness, I have to laugh because Bob was a ferocious competitor during our weekly racquetball slugfest, I must say. But apart from all his uncommonly fine traits, I'd like to share something of a historical perspective that is little known aspect of Bob's amazing legacy. It involves a place in our nation's history that, because of his modesty, very few people know about. By way of background, Bob was my very first attorney hire on the staff of the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, the largest, and some would say, because of its plenary subpoena power, the most fearsome subcommittee of either house. We both were responsible to Senator Charles Percy, as Marshall indicated, and Senator Percy, seeing him here, he was just a sterling figure. Bob and I had the utmost respect for him. Within months of his coming onto the staff, Bob's keen legal skills and his charm caused Senator Percy to designate him as his informal legal advisor. And among other things in that context, he was responsible for suggesting and vetting candidates for the federal judiciary. Why that was especially important is because the other senior senator from Illinois was Everett Dirksen, who was also the Senate Minority Leader. In that role, Dirksen had many fish to fry, but as a result of that, he deferred to Senator Percy on suggesting judicial candidates and nominees to the White House. At the time Chuck Percy entered the Senate in 1969, the 7th Judicial Circuit was generally deemed, and that includes Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, it was generally deemed to be the very worst of the 12 judicial circuits in this country. But during the 70s, with Bob vetting the candidates and Senator Percy recommending them, the reputation of the 7th Circuit went from worst to best in terms of judicial competence and integrity, a fact that is confirmed in sundry legal articles and commentary from that period. One of Senator Percy's earliest recommendations was a relatively unknown federal district court judge by the name of John Paul Stevens. Shortly after Stevens' elevation to the 7th Circuit, within the course of less than a year, President Nixon resigned in disgrace because of the Watergate scandal. And right after that, a vacancy opened up on the Supreme Court for then President Gerald Ford to fill. Senator Percy wanted to recommend that same jurist, John Paul Stevens, to elevation to the Supreme Court. And he asked Bob Sloan to assemble a compelling file on Judge Stevens' exemplary qualifications. Using all his legal and political skills, Bob tirelessly worked to prepare a brief that Percy, in turn, used to convince Minority Leader Dirksen and then the White House that Judge Stevens should be the nominee. And in very short order, then President Ford came to agree. But the story doesn't quite end there, because on the very morning that Senator Percy was to escort Judge Stevens to the White House to meet President Ford for the very first time and to join in the momentous official announcement, a prior meeting was held in the senator's private office. At the break of dawn, there sat three men: Senator Percy, soon-to-be Justice John Ball Stevens, and Bob Sloan. And to hear Bob relate to me coming back from there, the three of them chatted. Chatted was a term only Bob Sloan, in my life, I have never heard that used in any official parlance, but they chatted. They chatted about judicial philosophy, about legal matters, about events of the day, and who knows what else. Justice Stevens went on to become among the staunchest defenders of the First Amendment and is widely revered as one of the finest legal minds ever to serve on the court. Bob's indelible role in that course of events is really little known, but apart from his marriage to you, Dauphine, and the overwhelming pride that he felt in the birth and nurturing and achievements of Alexandra and Caroline and Edward, what I've just related was a distinctive moment in Bob's life and an integral part of his contribution to this nation. We all sorely miss Bob. He lives on in the wondrous memories he evokes, in the distinctions he achieved, in the many students that he monitored, that he mentored, that he taught and really cared for, and in the abiding love of Dauphine, and he lives on in the cherished values of his children who have done him proud. Bob leaves a lasting legacy. He's truly one of a kind. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm George Lehner. Dauphine, Caroline, Alexandra, Edward. It's funny, when I look at you, I remember so well the times you were at our house for birthday parties with my young daughters so many years ago. But actually, what I really do remember was that Bob was the star of the show one evening when he, before a large group of 5 or 6 years old, got down on his knees and demonstrated how to eat a marshmallow dangling from a string without using your hands, much to the amazement of all the other parents who were gathered. So, needless to say, Bob was really a man of many talents. And I think I actually have a video of that somewhere locked in the family vault. Yeah. I'm not sure Bob would want you to see that, but really, thank you for allowing me to share a few thoughts about Bob, and I do so with a high degree of apprehension. Bob never felt the need to step into the spotlight or to take a bow, and so I do hope you may forgive me if I find a few nice words to say about him. He was, after all, my first professional colleague, my law partner, and most importantly, my dear friend. So one of the first things I remember about Bob was that we shared an affinity for New Yorker cartoons. I'm sure that was something that he did with many of you. As a result, over a number of occasions at the State Department, where we first met as young lawyers, we would spend our lunch hour not discussing the law of treaties or state responsibility or various high-minded activities, but instead share views about the most recent New Yorker cartoons we had seen. And it's really over the past year or so that I have started to remember one in particular that caught our attention, and I think about it often. There were two weary old cowboys standing on Boot Hill, that infamous cemetery, looking at a lone tombstone. And on the tombstone, the words were carved, "He died with his options open." We laughed, I'm sure, but it was a nervous laugh because there really was something sad here. That poor cowboy presumably had failed to make any choices and presumably had had a lot of regrets. And while we may not have said it out loud, I think we both thought we really weren't going to let that happen to us. We knew, and I know we were grateful that at that point in our life we would have many options, and creating and making choices was a lot better than the alternative. But what I know now, some 45 years later, is that Bob did live a full life creating options and turning those into opportunities to grow. And at each step of the way, he found meaning and purpose in many, many different places and with so many different friends and colleagues. But I think that Bob was able to create and to exercise those different options in his professional life as a lawyer and to be, as everybody knows, so remarkably successful in each. Was not due to really luck or chance, but was really due in large measure to the person Bob was. Lawyers can become eloquent advocates or skilled technicians or pit bulls in the courtroom of renowned, and some are serious scholars, but Bob reached what I think really to be the highest rank of the profession. He was to so many a trusted counselor. People from CEOs to struggling students to politicians to just plain folks sought out Bob because they knew that before he would talk, he would listen, and he would listen deeply. They relied upon him for his ability to frame questions that would help them find their own right answer. And they trusted Bob because he was highly principled, valued integrity, and honesty above all else. There's really no official title in the law firmament of trusted counselor, but when you see people who tune to somebody like Bob, you know that they have reached the highest level of the profession. To quote Groucho Marx, as Bob often did, the secret of life and honesty is fair dealing. If you can fake that, you've got it made. But of course, Bob never had to fake it. Bob was all of that, but he was also really very unflappable. And I'm sure there are many stories about his days as general counsel at the multinational force in the Sinai, where his calm demeanor and his quiet determination and his courage literally helped to keep the peace in a very volatile part of the world. But my recollection of Bob's unflappability is a bit more mundane. It was at one of our first cases in the law firm that we had started. At the time was a large and widely publicized piece of litigation. I was the litigation department, Bob was the corporate department. There were four of us. I was scheduled to take the video deposition of a key witness, a key adverse witness in a case to be held in Tokyo at the US Embassy. But at the last minute, a family emergency prevented me from going. Of course, Bob volunteered to step in, but Bob had never taken a deposition before. So I tried to prep him on the key information we need to solicit, and off he went. 36 hours later, Bob called the office to report in, and I could tell that he was excited to tell me how it had went. But in the background of the call, I could hear rumbling and what even sounded like broken glass. What's going on, I asked. Bob paused. I think we're having an earthquake here. Are you sure we should be talking now, Bob? I was getting pretty nervous. No problem, he said. I'm in a hotel. I'm on the top story. I'll be fine. I was hardly reassured, but he proceeded to tell me in great detail that he had got what we needed in the deposition, even as the hotel that day continued to shake. I don't want to suggest, however, that Bob was always so calm, measured, and agreeable. We did have one very serious disagreement. We were at the bank filling out papers for a line of credit for our new firm. And when we got to the line in the application that said business name, I realized that we hadn't decided on a name for the firm. I looked at Bob and he said, "Your name's going first." I said, no, it's not. It's going to be Sloan Laner. He disagreed. We went back and forth, all of this in front of our loan officer. I finally think that we agreed on the lineup by age. Bob was, in fact, a few months older than I, and so he acquiesced. But I'm sure that the law officer must have had real doubts about the viability of our firm as he watched the two so-called senior partners argue about the firm's future name. The fact is, however, that Bob and I went on to co-author a book and to co-teach a course on European community law at Georgetown, so we were, I think, able to find a way to get along despite the deep division over our firm's name back then. The last time I saw Bob was in Paris. We met for breakfast, as we often did. He arrived, as he often did, carrying a book, newspapers, and a few other work papers under his arm. He was wearing, I suspect, the same sweater that he had worn almost 30 years earlier. I think it's fair to say, as several have noted, that Bob was not a fashion-forward kind of guy. Our conversations wandered, as it often did, between catching up on family and current events, on discussing recent book rereads or articles that we had seen. And I remember that politics and the rise of nationalism and polarization were much on our minds. We talked through at least 2 cups of coffee that morning. And as would be the case, during the course of our conversation, Bob suggested that I might like to read a book that he had recently read. It was the Meursault investigation, a retelling of Camus' The Stranger. And I almost always read the books Bob suggested I read, though I really never could keep up with them all. But I did pick this one up soon thereafter. And after I read it, I knew why Bob liked it so much. It's about big ideas, of course, but it approached Camus' story from a very different perspective, from the other side of the argument. It brought a new dimension to a story that you thought about, that you knew. And that was what Bob so often did in everything that he did. He was insatiably curious, always interested in a new perspective, a different point of view, and always willing to listen, to engage, but most of all, to learn. When we said goodbye that morning in Paris, I had no idea it would be the last time I saw Bob. I assumed there would be another breakfast, another chance to catch up, to compare notes, to take a measure of the state of the world, but it wasn't to be, sadly. Instead, I often think about how I can honor Bob's presence and our friendship in my life even today, and the answer really is pretty simple. It's simply to be more like Bob. I think he had certain rules he lived by. Be full of everyone else, not yourself. Praise others, but tell stories on yourself. Take your causes seriously, but not yourself. Change your politics to fit your values. Feel free to digress, as Bob often did. You never know where it might take you. Encourage others, delight in their success. Share your experience and share it generously. That was Bob, and that's why I believe that he lived surrounded by the love of his family and the deep affection of so many friends. There could be no greater measure for a life well lived. I miss him so much.
Thank you. Next, we are really honored to share recorded remarks from Justice Eliakim Rubinstein, who is the retired Deputy President of the Supreme Court of Israel, a distinguished jurist. He was also the Attorney General of Israel and Government Secretary, and he was also central to diplomacy in Israel with its neighbors, including chairing the delegation to the Treaty of Peace with Jordan and serving on the Israeli delegation to the Camp David Accords with Egypt. So we're really honored to be joined. He recorded remarks on this occasion, obviously being in Israel. The recording is fitting. So with that, I believe we'll share his remarks.
Dear Dufin and the family, I'm honored to be invited to speak a little bit about working with Bob in the old years and the friendship that we carved in the early 80s, that is almost 40 years ago. And I said in the beginning, the family, a pleasure to work with Bob because he was honest, he was smart, he was disarming. I mean, you couldn't, we agreed all the time. And it was, and I'd like to speak a little bit about the mission that Bob had as a general counsel of the multinational Force and Observers, as the organization which he helped to organize and to establish, is named fully, the abbreviation is MFO. And this is a child of the Israeli-Egyptian Treaty of Peace. I was involved in the negotiations on that in the late 70s. And since the UN would not adopt the treaty and would not adopt the Camp David Accords and would not establish a monitoring contingent to help in monitoring the treaty implementation in Sinai, the US committed in the exchanges with the American administration to help in establishing an organization. And it was established with the participation of different nations. The Director General and his immediate staff would be Americans usually, and basically all the time Americans, and the American diplomats, many of them retired ambassadors or retired State Department senior officials, and the force itself would be contingents from many countries, and usually commanded by a general. Let's say the original one was from Scandinavia, but from these kind of countries, and the contingents, the U.S. Secretary of State Haig at the time insisted that there would be also British, French, and the European countries, but much of it was countries from Asia, from Eastern Europe, like Fiji or Poland and so on. This organization is in situ, it remains in Sinai to this very day. Bob was the legal advisor, the general counsel, and he had his experience before in the State Department. And it wasn't easy to establish a new frame because it had numerous legal problems. I was at the time the legal advisor of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and so I was basically his counterpart. And you had to work on he worked versus the countries that sent the people, but also versus Egypt and Israel that had both been financing together with the US, but also giving some kind of immunities to that force and observers, because it has dual functions of monitoring and of making sure that the peace arrangements are intact. And it was a mission which also had a value, a moral value, a historical value. Here are two countries that had 5 wars between 48 and 73, and here in the late 70s they make peace, but peace had to be monitored because we wanted to make sure that Sinai will not be a springboard against us, and so the agreement was very detailed. The Sinai was divided in terms of the forces that Egypt could have, and there was even a little strip in Israel that was supposed to be a little bit limited. But the bottom line is that there was a lot of legal work, And Bob did it with a sense of mission, not just as a job. It was a mission. And he was, as I said, fun, a pleasure to work with. We understood each other's concerns. His boss, Ray Hunt, blessed memory also, who was a fine diplomat, American, very straightforward and serious diplomat who was sadly assassinated in '84, I believe, by Italian assassins, whatever. And but he was the director general. Bob was his legal advisor, and they worked well together. And I read somewhere that Bob was somebody who could meet a friend for coffee in any city of the world. I read somebody said that or wrote that when he passed away. And indeed, the friendship that we carved in those years in the early 80s, this is 82, 83, 84, in those days, remained a very sweet, very positive memory. And while we didn't, we weren't in contact very often, but whenever the opportunity came, including meeting in Paris and meeting here in Jerusalem, and it was a pleasure. He was able, he was honest, he was nice, and that mission was fulfilled, and it remains. The organization remains. The need remains, and it takes new shapes and new forms. Thank God the peace is intact. The relations between Israel and the military and Israel and Egypt on the military and the strategic part are, as far as I understand, I'm not there anymore, but in this respect, okay. We would hope that the civilian relations would be better, but still the fact is, as President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin said, no more war. So there hasn't been a war, thank God. And Bob contributed to the forging, to the building of that peace. So, dear Dauphine, it's, I can't say it's a pleasure because we talk about a memorial event. It would be better if we could talk to Bob, but we don't know the Almighty's ways, and this opportunity gave me time to think about those days. One more word, Bob was Jewish, and the funeral, I must say, I was positively surprised in a way, because I didn't know what this Jewish practice was, but the fact that this rabbi, I think his name was Cohn or something, the rabbi did the ceremony, was for me as an observant Jew very very moving, very close to the heart. So I wish you and the family, 2 generations now of young people, all the best, and I cherish Bob's memory.
My name is Catherine Lichtenberg, and Dauphine, Bob's extended family, and friends, and Tulane, thank you so much for including me in this wonderful tribute to Bob. It means a tremendous amount to me. Bob was an extraordinary friend, colleague, and mentor, an extraordinary person, as every one of you who's spoken so far has recognized. I worked with Bob during his entire tenure as Executive Vice President and General Counsel of Entergy Corporation. My office was a few steps down the hall from his, and I have a vivid picture of it in my mind. He had an office suite with a desk in the back, and as you come forward, there was a conference room table where we often sat and chatted. And, and not surprisingly, on that conference table were his work files and another folder with his newspaper clippings and his magazine articles, and probably in there somewhere was a New Yorker cartoon. And also a book or two on his conference room table in his office. And generally, it was not mass market fiction or anything having to do with the law. And I don't think anybody here would be very surprised at that description of his conference room table. Bob was a lifelong student and a lifelong teacher. His intellectual curiosity was insatiable, and his intellectual capacity was unlimited. Bob and I went through a lot together at Entergy. The collapse of retail competition in Entergy's Texas territory, which, as it turned out, was not such a bad thing, as time would tell. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission order that required one set of ratepayers to pay hundreds of millions of dollars to another set of ratepayers, a very controversial order that ultimately led to fundamental and lasting changes in how Entergy planned and operated its electric system. And, of course, Hurricane Katrina, with the breach of the levees, the destruction of the utility infrastructure, the flooding of 80% of the city, and the bankruptcy of Entergy New Orleans, to name just a few of the crises, large and small, that happened to find their way to a lawyer's desk sitting somewhere in Entergy Corporation. So, for example, with respect to Hurricane Katrina, for those of you who were fortunate enough not to have experienced that catastrophic storm in 2005, let me just say its devastation was incomprehensible, recovery from it daunting, and the resilience displayed and required inspiring. We each had a role to play. My family and I had left New Orleans a couple of days before the storm hit, and we went to Hot Springs, Arkansas. And my job was to find my way from Hot Springs to Baton Rouge to help the gas business, which was both on fire and underwater in the city of New Orleans, to assess the damage safely and to help document a process for making repairs that could withstand regulatory scrutiny. After that, I worked with a team of lawyers and experts to put in place a rate-making plan that would support the company's emergence from bankruptcy, which eventually happened. Bob's work was at a different level entirely and in different cities. He led a team of lawyers who mapped out the larger strategy for Entergy Corporation and its shareholders. He worked with the corporation's senior executives and board of directors to assure the stability and viability of the business enterprise itself. And as you know, the lights came back throughout the city as the waters receded, the gas system was restored, and Entergy New Orleans emerged from bankruptcy as a financially viable company. In 2007, I was promoted and became a direct report of Bob's. And in corporate lingo, what that means is that there was no longer someone, a boss between Bob and me. I reported directly to Bob. And nothing changed in my interactions with Bob. Like for everyone here, I was always a person to him, first and foremost. Not a job description, not a box on an organizational chart, not a chess piece to be moved around as the corporate winds change directions. It was a job I did not feel ready for. I felt like an imposter for much of my professional life. Circumstances in my personal life made my success highly improbable. I was also the first woman in that position, and I did not believe in myself or my abilities. But Bob did. Through thick and thin, Bob had faith and, most importantly, trusted in me to fill shoes that were exceptionally large and that someone like me had not worn before. When a leader like Bob trusts you, you push yourself a little harder, you reach a little higher, and you dig a little deeper. Frankly, when someone like Bob trusts you, it's at least as good a motivator as a formal performance review or a check-the-box evaluation form. Bob was not a micromanager. That quality goes hand in hand with his trust and his humility. He led with a light touch. The trappings of power were not appealing to him in the slightest. But often when I would brief him on a particular topic, dutifully reciting the operative facts in the controlling law, he would gently challenge me with, "But Kathy, what does it really mean?" Bob viewed issues through a wider lens. What is the larger narrative here, and how will it be understood by others? Key questions for a maturing lawyer and protege. Bob's door was always open. He had time to ask you how you were doing, what you were doing, how was your family, and of course, what were you reading? And a word on that subject, perhaps a quaintly outdated idea, but it is mine. There is no substitute for in-person interaction for promoting the intangibles: friendship, trust, connection, empathy. And I was privileged to have Bob as my office neighbor. When you haven't seen someone in a while, it can take an effort sometimes to reconstruct the smile, the signature gesture, to hear the voice, and sometimes the images or sounds that come to mind are a bit vague or hazy or out of focus. With the passage of time, they can become increasingly dim. Not so with Bob. Bob's inner light, his luminous presence shines on. We can all see the crinkle around his eyes and the tilt of his head as he smiles, the cheerful and inquisitive voice as he greets us. Bob is still somewhere very near, having slipped away into the next room.
I'm Vernon Palmer, and thank you for letting me speak about Bob. And Dean, thank you so much for this important event. One thing is clear to me. Bob was universally loved and respected. There's just so much love in this room, I can hardly stand it. It's very daunting for someone like me, who met Bob late, only a few years ago. It's very hard to say anything without fear of making some kind of mistake or missing something important about Bob, getting it backwards perhaps. And I didn't know what was going to be said prior to these remarks, so I may be repetitious a little bit. and yet I want to speak. My perception of Bob as a man and as a colleague. First, he was a thorough internationalist. In fact, I've never met a greater example of an American internationalist. His entire career, it seems to me, had an international trajectory. On the one hand, it was filled with public service, as in his years in the Sinai, or with the MFO, as Justice Rubenstein discussed. His years with the State Department before then. And then his later legal work was also international in scope and multilateral. His Brussels firm, I don't know enough about it, but I'm looking at his resume. Drafted contracts for between the United States, Western Europe, Asia, conducted negotiations with French-speaking West African countries like Togo. His work with the First National Bank of Chicago reflects he managed the sovereign debt of 26 different countries. He had a deep understanding of the EU. He practiced that law. And then he taught that law. Bob respected the nations and cultures he worked with, or he dealt with. With his knowledge of foreign languages, his deep knowledge of the legal framework, he moved easily in these circles. He was the antithesis of an American first man. He never closed himself off. In all my conversations, he never disparaged any nation, group, culture, religion, any differences. They didn't seem to mean much to Bob, except they needed to be understood, but not to be disparaged. Second, I'd like to say this about Bob. He seemed to me to be a quintessential team player. He was selfless and energetic. He was an energetic part of this faculty long before he had an office, long before he had a title. He was teaching without portfolio, really. He was a great facilitator of others, an enabler in the best sense of the word. And he moved this faculty forward with no attempt to take credit, and regardless of whether he received compensation. And in fact, from conversations I had with Bob, he had a kind of abhorrence of money discussions. He changed the subject every time you got close to a money discussion. Time and again, he would teach or co-teach courses like energy law or law and literature with Ed Sherman without pay. Without being asked, he would recruit students for me to come to the Paris summer program. He would buttonhole them in the halls and then tell me later he had done so, and which ones looked amenable to his blandishments. He offered, and this came too late, unfortunately, he offered a novel thing. It probably wouldn't have been approved by the faculty, but he offered to co-teach with me in French here at the law school a course on the founding fathers of the European Union. Without prompting, he prepared and delivered a remarkable lecture for the Paris summer students on the Dreyfus affair. And a descendant of Dreyfus, Alfred Dreyfus, happened to be in the audience. Incidentally, this address should be published. It's just too important. It's not just about Dreyfus, the Jewish scapegoat. It discusses the parallels in our own history in the United States, from the Palmer raids to Korematsu and the Japanese internment. All of that is in this paper ostensibly about Alfred Dreyfus. Bob he does all these things without prompting, without expecting any reward. He was a great team player, like a kind of selfless basketball guard who's always looking for the open man to score and never shooting himself. Thirdly, Bob seemed to be ruled by an extraordinary sense of duty, which made him do things and carry out assignments that others would have avoided. I could not help but notice this about him. For example, he knew how unpopular nuclear power plants were, especially to his environmentalist friends. But he also knew that the problem of disposing of nuclear waste safely was upon us now in the United States and upon other nations. It was a problem for Bob. Regardless of your views on nuclear power plants, it needed to be studied, dealt with. He told me many times about the negative reactions of people he informed he was working on this project and the negative reactions he was receiving. Yet he could not turn down the assignment. The request came from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences to write a report, which he did, called The Decommissioning of the United States Nuclear Fleet, an important report that was recently published posthumously. Finally, on a personal level, Bob was a gregarious, sociable, intellectually stimulating colleague, the greatest colleague or conversationalist you could ask for. He would come to my office often just before I was trying to leave for class. He didn't know my schedule. And he would launch into a conversation, again, about books, about what's going on in France, what's going on with his friends. He would draw me in and talk about everything from Shakespeare to Samuel Johnson's dictionary, which he loved, to the latest political outrage in Washington. I cannot ever remember a conversation about law that I had with Bob, and we were two professors of law. I came away from these conversations refreshed, but late for class and a little less prepared than I should have been. He caused me to read a lot, books new and old. Just because he was reading them, I was reading them. I had to read them. I had to not disappoint Bob. He and Dauphine welcomed me to their home in France in the summer, where I found Bob was both francophone and francophile. And he was so clearly in his element, so clearly happy in the summers there. In this building, he was a denizen of the library. A professor without an office, often. Cheerfully, working in the reading room like a student. Bob enjoyed being an unpretentious student, like he was starting all over again. Tackling new subjects, remembering no doubt his Harvard days or his Michigan days. So now as I look back, I met Bob maybe 4 years ago. I realized two things. We do not always know the grandeur of our colleagues. We see them obscurely in the hall, going to class with a book in hand. We say hello, and we ask how they are, and then maybe the conversation stops. But we can miss so easily the great person, the very exceptional person in our midst. I was still finding out about this very exceptional person when he passed away. This faculty may never know who we had. This faculty may never realize the blessing that he bestowed on it. I think he touched everyone he ever met, and they will never forget him. One further point, though. We teach comparative law at Tulane, and we're very proud of it. He lived it. He lived it. And there's a difference. We teach it from books. He practiced it in action, in the Sinai, in Brussels, in Washington. Nevertheless, there he was, with all his attainments, still the bright student in the reading room of the library, reading de Gaulle's biography, I'll never forget, or preparing a lecture on Dreyfus, or thinking of law and literature with Ed Sherman. To me, it was amazing. He was so multidimensional, so humble, so selfless, with so much to transfer to us. I, too, cannot say how much I miss him.
Realize there'd be a picture. Sent a better one, probably. Well, I'm Brian. I think it goes without saying that I knew Professor Sloan for less time than the other speakers this evening, but it's testament to his character that I'm almost certain that he left no less of an impact on myself and countless other students that came through Tulane. I first met Professor Sloan when I attended a short lecture he gave on nuclear power hosted by Professor Fetke. I approached him afterward to ask a few questions, and as we were talking, he invited me to get coffee the next day. Of course. There was free pizza at the talk, and now this guy that I've never met might buy me a cup of coffee. That's not a bad day's work for a broke law student. But little did I know that would be the first of many cups of coffee with Professor Sloan. And over the years, while I was at Tulane, I progressed from an acquaintance to a research assistant, then to a student and a mentee, and I really think that Professor Sloan eventually became a good friend, and I know that many other students felt the same way. As others have already commented, Professor Sloan had a wide array of pursuits throughout his career and a breadth of interests, personal and professional, and all this seemed to be possible in part because Sloan was able to see things from such a diverse array of perspectives. While meeting with him regarding his research, his discussion of a commercial or business point would inevitably lead to additional remarks on related environmental, social, historical, geopolitical matters affecting the issue, some of which were germane to the paper that he was writing and others less so. But with a wry smile, he'd eventually get us back on track. You know, Brian, if only you didn't have to go to class, we could sit here and solve the rest of the world's problems. But it was not only academic papers and legal work to which he applied his multifaceted perspectives. He approached the lives of his students and others that he met with the same genuine curiosity and delight. Whether going out for coffee or talking with him in his office or just bumping into him somewhere on campus, somehow Professor Sloan always had a way of making you believe that he had all the time in the world and that you were the most important person he could be talking to at that moment. In fact, I knew he had retired from Entergy when I first met him, and I assumed that he was teaching a class here at the law school. So I figured he had plenty of time on his hands. But I think when I met him, he was commuting to Baton Rouge 2 or 3 days a week to work as director of the Energy Law Center at LSU. He was a professor at LSU. He was working at least part-time at his law firm. He was preparing lectures on the side at Tulane, and he was working on his paper for the American Academy of the Arts and Sciences. As a law student who thought that I had too much to do, it was hard to comprehend how he managed to do all this and still leisurely meet with students, student after student. in the student lounge over coffee, at PJ's, or even grabbing breakfast, Professor Sloan was a persistent and a pleasant sight on campus. And I'm sure the law school is not the same without him. Sometimes time would get away from Professor Sloan. More than once was I, as Professor Palmer mentioned, more than once was I also late to class or another meeting because I scheduled a meeting with Professor Sloan too close to another appointment. But probably the worst infraction was when I was talking to Professor Sloan and we kept talking and talking, and I ended up showing, it was at least 10, maybe 15 minutes late to my energy regulation class. But fortunately for me, the professor of that class was Bob Sloan, who also happened to be late that day. Okay, I'm sure Sloan would want us to wrap this up soon. As has been noted, another trademark of his was singing other people's praises rather than his own. I don't need to harp on his legal accolades or work ethic or professional accomplishments. As impressive as these achievements were, I think Professor Sloan really left his mark on the law school and those around him through his generous compliments and keen observations, through acting as a mentor and friend to new law students and seasoned LLMs alike, and through long and enlightening conversations. That's how I and countless students from around the world will remember him, and I think he'd like it that way. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Edward. I'm the last child, only boy. This is at my sister's wedding 6 years ago, I believe. So it's great to be with you. You know, last year during the funeral, we had limited participation from out-of-towners. So it's great to see so many of you here and to hear you speak and give amazing speeches. So we're so grateful. We're grateful to Dean Meyer for organizing this and to our mom for making this happen and keeping us sane over the last year and a half. So full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer, and I feel a mix of pride for that and inferiority as well. But so I don't necessarily have much to say about my dad's legal career or the law. But one thing I did want to talk about was my dad's intellectual curiosity, which so many people have already mentioned, so it feels a bit repetitive. So I apologize. But that is one thing that has kind of inspired me in my career, and I think it's the case for my sisters as well. So, you know, my dad's curiosity, as has been mentioned by so many of you so far, took two main forms. One was reading. He would read pretty much anything, but he tended to gravitate towards really boring stuff. As I don't know if people know this, but he was a big fan of the history of Christianity. So, you know, like 800, 900, that kind of era, and before. So not the most interesting thing. As has also been mentioned, he had a 5-pound dictionary from Samuel Johnson that you needed a ladder to take down from the wall. And, you know, this gave him a lot of skills. He could use Shakespeare in conversation, which was very impressive, so it had practical use. So whenever I would make fun of him for example, wearing a sweater without a t-shirt under, he would tell me, sharper than a serpent's tooth, which is from King Lear, I believe. And I actually Googled the full quote this morning, and it goes, "How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless child." And so that was this morning, and I felt at the same time grateful that he had never completed the quote with me, and also kind of a newfound respect that he stopped it right there for me. And now I feel really bad also about how I treated him sometimes. And his curiosity took another kind of form, which you are all aware of by now, which was he was very interested in meeting and talking to many different people, students, colleagues. He made some of his friends on subway platforms. And as my second cousin Anna said last year, he would even treat little children as his equal in conversation and want to hear everything they had to say about any sort of topic. So he was very egalitarian in that way. So we talked a lot about, you know, his intellectual curiosity, and was it just for fun or for show, or did it have any purpose? And to me, in thinking about this, it did. And so I think that's something to take away from in my career, in my personal life as well. So the first thing is that his curiosity offered him some of the richest experiences of his life. As his good friend Jack Berrig said at the funeral last year, he said he one day in 1984, he received a wedding invitation from a French countess, my grandmother. And as Jack said, a countess, not bad for a guy from the South Side. So my dad's interest in the world beyond the South Side of Chicago, and for some reason in French people in particular, and in French culture, led him to meet my mother, which was one of the greatest experiences of his life, of course. But secondly, in more professional kind of terms, because that's why we're here, his curiosity led him to become, as many have mentioned here, one of the fairest people that I knew. And so, of course, when you gather a lot of knowledge from books and from meeting people from different backgrounds and different perspectives, you end up seeing things in a more nuanced and moderate way, an objective way. And so this led to some friendly disagreements between me and him about politics or current events or anything in which I would take a bit more of a radical view, and he would come in with a more moderate kind of perspective because he had the benefit of greater knowledge, more long-standing knowledge as well. And so he tended to win those arguments. And so that led him to, as again many of you have said, to never demonize anyone or anything, almost, except more recently a certain politician. But it led him to basically always give people the benefit of the doubt and to see the things from their perspective, and to be careful in his assessments of any sort of current event or any sort of person. And he would often, you know, tell me, oh, so-and-so is not a bad guy, whereas to me, that person was pretty crappy. And so I think that was very representative of the person he was, and that came from his pursuit of knowledge and trying to understand others and their perspective. And again, not a bad trait to have in a lawyer or somebody involved in the legal profession. And finally, his curiosity led him to have a satisfactory professional career. We were talking about this with my mom recently, how nothing frustrated my dad more than after work, sitting in his office trying to have conversations with colleagues who were just not interested in having an intellectual conversation with him about current events or about anything else. So clearly that excludes you, Vernon, and many others in this room. But nothing frustrated him more than that, because in the end, that was why he was there. He wasn't there to submit a deliverable or to accomplish a certain task. He was there for a greater mission of better understanding a certain topic or engaging in a certain debate and trying to further the conversation about whether it was renewable energy or nuclear waste disposal. He just wanted to get people's opinion, to debate, to learn, and it was just not enough to just, at the end of the day at 5 p.m., to go home and move on to other things. And so me in my personal life, in my professional life especially, I often think of my day or the week that I had, and I ask myself, was it worth it? Did I learn something? Did I have a good time, as I imagine he might have done? And if the answer is no, maybe it's time to consider a change. Thank you again.
want to say a word of thanks to all of the speakers. You have all been really inspiring and in telling Bob's story, and he certainly has left his imprint indelibly on this place, and we feel it in what he helped us build in our Center for Energy Law, in the courses he led, in his collaboration, in his coffees breaks, but most of all, in each of us who he touched in every way. So we're incredibly grateful to all of you for being here, and to all of the members of the family for sharing this with us. And I want to invite all of you to a reception just across the hallway, and I don't think we have hot coffee there, as we probably should have for Bob, but we have other things, and so hopefully you'll come and join us. Thank you so much.